Imagine a factory where a ship, an entire ocean-going vessel weighing thousands of tons, gets built in less time than it takes most people to renovate their kitchen. Now, imagine that factory isn't just building one ship, it's building 3 per day, every single day. While German submarines are sinking Allied vessels faster than anyone thought possible, American shipyards are doing something that seems physically impossible. They're building cargo ships faster than the enemy can destroy them. In November 1942, a shipyard in California assembled a complete 10,000-ton freighter in just 4 days and 15 hours. 4 days! From laying the keel to launching a fully functional ship into the Pacific. The Germans called it impossible. The British called it reckless. But by the end of World War II, America had built 2,710 of these vessels, Liberty ships, and they didn't just change naval warfare, they rewrote the rules of industrial production forever. This is the story of how a nation turned shipbuilding into an assembly line, how welding replaced riveting and changed everything, and how ordinary Americans, many who had never seen the ocean, became the unlikely heroes who saved the world. But here's what nobody tells you about the Liberty ships. Their success wasn't just about speed. It was about controlled chaos, acceptable losses, and a gamble so audacious that even today, engineers study it to understand the limits of mass production.
Let's rewind to 1940. Britain is standing alone against Nazi Germany, and it's starving. Not metaphorically, actually starving. The island nation imports 70% of its food, and German U-boats are turning the Atlantic Ocean into a graveyard. Every day, submarines commanded by men like Günther Prien and Otto Kretschmer are sending Allied merchant ships to the bottom. We're talking about 500,000 tons of shipping lost every single month at the peak of the Battle of the Atlantic. Here's the mathematics of desperation. Britain needs supplies to survive. Those supplies cross the Atlantic in merchant ships. U-boats sink those ships faster than Britain can replace them. The equation is brutally simple. If the rate of sinking exceeds the rate of building, Britain loses the war. Churchill himself would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat threat. Not the Blitz, not the fall of France, the submarines. But there's a deeper problem that nobody's talking about in 1940. Traditional shipbuilding is an art form. Master craftsmen spend months riveting together steel plates, installing engines, fitting out cabins. A conventional cargo ship takes roughly a year to build. Some take 18 months. The British shipyards are working at capacity, but capacity isn't enough. They're building perhaps 2 or 3 ships per month across all their yards combined. Meanwhile, Karl Donitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, is refining wolf-pack tactics, coordinated submarine attacks that turn convoys into floating coffins. The breaking point comes in the spring of 1941. In just 2 months, March and April, U-boats sink 142 Allied merchant ships. The tonnage lost is staggering. Over 800,000 tons of shipping vanished beneath the waves. Food, weapons, fuel, medical supplies, all of it feeding fish instead of soldiers.
Enter an unlikely savior, a man who had never built a ship in his life. Henry J. Kaiser was a construction magnate who made his fortune building dams, the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam. He knew concrete and earth moving, not ships and seawater. When the U.S. Maritime Commission approached shipbuilders in 1940 about rapidly expanding production, Kaiser did something nobody expected. He said yes, not just to building ships, but to building them in a completely revolutionary way. Kaiser looked at shipbuilding and saw what the traditional shipwrights couldn't. It was a construction problem, not a maritime problem. And construction problems had solutions. He'd assembled massive dams using prefabrication, modular construction, and systematic workflows. Why couldn't ships be built the same way? The establishment laughed at him. The American Bureau of Shipping was skeptical. British naval architects called his ideas typically American, and they didn't mean it as a compliment. These were people who understood that ships were complex, that they required craftsmanship, that you couldn't just slap one together like a garden shed. But Kaiser had something traditional shipbuilders didn't. He had Henry Ford's playbook. Ford had revolutionized automobile manufacturing with the assembly line, turning custom craftwork into standardized production. Kaiser proposed doing the same thing with 441-foot-long ocean freighters. The Maritime Commission, desperate and out of options, gave him a contract. Here's where the story gets interesting. The ship design Kaiser would build wasn't even American. It was based on a British tramp steamer design from the 1930s, the Ocean-class cargo ship. The British had shared the plans as part of Lend-Lease cooperation. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't fast, top speed of just 11 knots, slower than many submarines on the surface. Naval architects jokingly called it a bathtub with an engine. But it had one critical advantage. It was simple, utterly, beautifully simple.
Now, here's the technical innovation that made everything possible, and it's something most people completely overlook. Welding. That's it. That's the revolution. But stick with me, because this matters more than you think. Traditional ships were riveted. Teams of men would heat rivets until they glowed red, then hammer them through overlapping steel plates while the metal was still hot. A good riveting crew could install maybe 200 rivets per day. A single Liberty ship required roughly 300,000 rivets. You do the math, that's months of work just in riveting alone. And it required skilled craftsmen, men who had apprenticed for years to learn the trade. Welding changed everything. Instead of overlapping plates held together by rivets, welded ships had plates joined edge to edge with molten metal. It was faster, vastly faster. A welder could join more steel in a day than a riveting crew could in a week. It was lighter. No rivet heads meant less weight and more cargo capacity. And here's the kicker. It could be taught. You could take someone who had never held a torch and train them to make acceptable welds in a matter of weeks. But welding had a dark secret, one that would come back to haunt the Liberty ship program. Welded joints created continuous stress points across the hull. Unlike riveted construction, where cracks would stop at the next rivet hole, a crack in a welded hull could propagate across an entire ship. In cold water, with steel that turned brittle at low temperatures, this could be catastrophic. Ships could, and did, literally break in half. We'll come back to that nightmare. For now, understand that welding was the technology that made mass production possible. Kaiser's shipyards would employ 27,000 welders at their peak. Think about that number. 27,000 people, most of whom had never welded anything before the war, now joining together the steel skeletons of ocean-going vessels.
Kaiser's innovation wasn't just about welding. It was about reimagining the entire process. Here's how traditional shipbuilding worked. You build the ship from the keel up, inside a dry dock, with workers crawling all over a single vessel, installing everything in sequence. It's like building a house: foundation, frame, roof, systems, finishing. Kaiser said, what if we build it like a car? What if we prefabricate entire sections in different parts of the shipyard, then assemble them like Lego blocks? The Liberty ship was divided into roughly 250 prefabricated sections. These weren't small pieces. We're talking about multi-ton modules, complete rooms with piping and wiring already installed. While one team was laying a keel, other teams across the shipyard were building bow sections, stern sections, deck houses, engine rooms, everything fabricated in parallel. Picture this. In one corner of the yard, workers are building the ship's bridge, complete with windows, controls, bunks for officers, everything. In another area, the engine room is being assembled as a complete unit, with the massive triple-expansion steam engine already mounted and connected. Elsewhere, cargo holds are being formed, with bulkheads and ladders in place.
When it was time for final assembly, giant cranes would lift these multi-ton sections and lower them into position. Welders would join them together. The hull would take shape not over months, but over days. Systems that would normally be installed by workers climbing around inside a cramped, dark hull were already in place, installed in factories with proper lighting and space. But here's what made it truly revolutionary: standardization. Every Liberty ship was identical, not similar, identical. The first Liberty ship and the 2,710th Liberty ship had exactly the same design, the same parts, the same measurements. This meant that workers became specialists. You weren't a general shipbuilder anymore. You were the person who installed electrical systems in Section D4. You did it over and over until you could do it in your sleep. Efficiency skyrocketed.
Now let's talk about who actually built these ships, because this is where the story gets deeply human. Kaiser shipyards didn't employ traditional shipwrights and naval craftsmen. They couldn't. There weren't enough of them. Instead, the yards filled with farmers, housewives, retirees, teenagers, people from landlocked states who had never seen an ocean, let alone built a ship. Rosie the Riveter? She wasn't just propaganda. Women made up a huge portion of the workforce. In some yards, nearly a third of all workers. They were welders, crane operators, electricians, inspectors. Wendy the welder became as iconic as Rosie. These weren't women doing women's work in supporting roles. They were doing the heavy industrial labor that built the ships. Take the story of the Richmond shipyards in California, Kaiser's flagship operation. At peak production, they employed 90,000 workers. Many had migrated from the South and Midwest, drawn by high wages and war work. They lived in hastily constructed housing projects. They worked in shifts around the clock, 24/7 operations. The shipyards never slept. Training was intense but brief. Remember, traditional shipbuilders trained for years. Kaiser's workers got weeks, sometimes days. They learned one job and did it repeatedly. The yards employed an army of inspectors to catch mistakes, but the system worked because of radical simplification. You didn't need to understand the entire ship. You needed to understand your piece of it. There were accidents. Industrial work in the 1940s was far more dangerous than today. There were labor disputes. Despite patriotic fervor, workers still wanted fair wages and safe conditions. There was discrimination. African American workers faced segregation even in these yards of opportunity, often relegated to the most dangerous jobs or excluded from certain positions entirely. But the production numbers don't lie. By 1943, Kaiser's Richmond yards were launching a completed Liberty ship every single day. Not starting one, completing and launching one. Every day, a new 441-foot freighter would slide into the water, ready for fitting out and service.
This brings us to November 1942 and the SS Robert E. Peary, the ship that would set a record that still sounds impossible. Kaiser's Yard No. 2 in Richmond, California, announced they would attempt to build a complete Liberty ship in less than a week. Not as a publicity stunt, though it was definitely that too, but as a proof of concept. To show that with perfect coordination, ultimate efficiency, and round-the-clock work, a ship could be built in days, not months. On November 8, 1942, at 12:01 a.m., they laid the keel. Workers had been preparing for weeks. Every single component was fabricated and ready. Every team knew exactly what they needed to do and in what sequence. The choreography was planned down to the minute. What followed was controlled chaos. Thousands of workers moved in coordinated swarms. Cranes swung massive sections through the air. Welders worked in teams, joining sections as soon as they were positioned. Electricians ran wiring. Pipe fitters installed systems. Painters followed behind, coating everything. The ship grew like a time-lapse video. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after laying the keel, the SS Robert E. Peary was complete. On November 12th, she was launched, fully functional, ready for service. The crowd watching was stunned. Newsreel cameras captured the moment. Kaiser had proven that what seemed impossible was merely improbable. But here's what often gets left out of the story. The Robert E. Peary wasn't just for show. She entered service immediately, joined a convoy, and made multiple Atlantic crossings carrying war supplies. She survived the war and continued in service until 1963. That stunt ship, built in 4 days, worked for 21 years. The record was both inspiring and cautionary. Kaiser never tried to replicate it. The effort required to build a ship that fast was actually less efficient than building them at a more moderate pace. The Robert E. Peary proved capability, not optimal practice. The regular production schedule, 1 ship every 30 days per slipway, was actually more efficient when accounting for worker fatigue, quality control, and resource allocation.
Let's zoom out and look at the numbers, because they're so large they almost become meaningless. So let me make them concrete. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships in 4 years. That's 1.85 ships per day, every single day for 4 years straight. Christmas, Thanksgiving, 4th of July, didn't matter. Ships kept sliding into the water. Here's another way to think about it. Liberty ships had a deadweight tonnage of about 10,500 tons each. Multiply that by 2,710 ships, and you get 28.5 million tons of shipping capacity created in 4 years. To put that in perspective, the entire British merchant fleet in 1939, built over decades, totaled about 21 million tons. America built more shipping capacity in 4 years than Britain had accumulated in its entire history as a maritime nation. The speed of construction kept accelerating. In 1941, the average Liberty ship took 230 days to build. By 1942, it was down to 60 days. By 1943, the average was 42 days. Some yards were averaging 30 days. Think about that learning curve. In 2 years, they reduced construction time by 85%. But speed wasn't the only metric. Cost mattered too. The original contract price for Liberty ships was about $2 million per vessel in 1941 dollars. By 1943, through economies of scale and process improvements, the cost had dropped to about $1.5 million. They were building ships faster and cheaper simultaneously. Kaiser's competitors, traditional shipyards, were forced to adapt or die. Bethlehem Steel, Newport News Shipbuilding, companies with century-long histories of naval construction had to adopt Kaiser's methods. The old ways simply couldn't compete. It was Darwinian industrial evolution in real time. Here's what this production meant strategically. The Germans were sinking Allied shipping at a rate of roughly 500,000 tons per month at the peak of the U-boat war in 1942. Liberty ships displaced 10,500 tons each, so every month the Allies needed to build roughly 48 Liberty ships just to break even with losses. In 1943, American yards were building 140 Liberty ships per month. Suddenly, the math wasn't just breaking even, it was overwhelmingly in favor of the Allies. Admiral Donitz realized by late 1943 that he'd lost the tonnage war. U-boats were still sinking ships, but replacement ships were arriving faster than submarines could sink them. The equation had flipped. The industrial capacity of the United States had turned a battle of attrition into an inevitable Allied victory. Now we need to talk about the disasters, because the Liberty ship story isn't all triumph. Remember that welding issue I mentioned? It came back with a vengeance, and in the most horrifying way possible. On January 16, 1943, the SS Schenectady was docked in Portland, Oregon. It was a cold day, the kind of cold that makes steel brittle. Without warning, the ship broke in half. Not gradually, not over time, it just suddenly cracked completely in two right at the midship.
The sound was reportedly like a gunshot. The ship's back broke while it was sitting peacefully in calm water, fully loaded but stationary. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a nightmare. Over the next 2 years, approximately 1,500 Liberty ships suffered serious stress cracks. 20 ships broke completely in half, some while underway in the ocean. 3 ships were total losses, simply disintegrating at sea. Crews died. Cargo was lost. Ships that cost millions of dollars and months of effort became floating or sinking scrap. The culprit was a combination of factors that nobody had fully anticipated. First, the steel used in Liberty ships, mild steel, chosen for ease of welding and availability, became extremely brittle in cold North Atlantic water. Second, welded construction created continuous stress paths across the hull. A crack could start small, maybe at a rivet hole where a hatch was attached, or at a weld with a tiny defect, and then propagate catastrophically. Third, and this is the engineering detail that matters, the ships had sharp corners in their design, square hatch corners, abrupt transitions in the deck structure. These created stress concentration points. Under normal conditions, not a problem. Under extreme cold, heavy seas, and the cyclic loading of waves, these corners became crack initiators. The most famous case was the SS John P. Gaines, which broke in half in the North Pacific in November 1943. The ship was carrying ammunition and aircraft, steaming through rough seas in freezing weather. Suddenly, a crack appeared at the deck edge and raced across the ship. Within minutes, the vessel had broken completely in two. The bow section stayed afloat long enough for most of the crew to abandon ship, but the stern section sank almost immediately. 10 men died. The investigations that followed were intensive. Metallurgists studied the failures. Engineers analyzed stress patterns. Constance Tipper, a British metallurgist, did groundbreaking work on the phenomenon of brittle fracture in steel. Her research would later influence everything from building codes to pipeline design. Here's where the story shows the resilience of the program. Instead of scrapping Liberty ships or halting production, which would have been catastrophic for the war effort, engineers implemented fixes on the fly. Ships already in service and ships still being built were modified. The solution was elegantly simple: round the corners, literally. Engineers added crack arrestor plates, curved pieces of steel, at stress concentration points, especially at the corners of hatches. These rounded corners prevented stress from concentrating at sharp angles. They also added steel straps across areas prone to cracking, providing alternate load paths. Existing ships were retrofitted. Every Liberty ship was inspected, and modifications were installed. The program was massive, thousands of ships being modified simultaneously at ports around the world. New ships coming off the production lines had the improvements built in from the start. The metallurgy was also addressed. Steel specifications were tightened. Welding procedures were improved. Welders were trained to recognize defects, to preheat joints in cold weather, to use techniques that reduced internal stresses. Quality control inspectors became more rigorous. X-ray inspection of critical welds became standard practice. And it worked. After the modifications, catastrophic failures dropped dramatically. Ships still developed cracks, that's inevitable with the stresses of ocean service, but they didn't break in half anymore. The cracks were detected during inspections and repaired before they became critical. The Liberty ship structural failure saga taught the entire engineering world about fracture mechanics. The lessons learned influenced the design of everything from aircraft to bridges. The Liberty ship's problems weren't swept under the rug. They were studied, understood, and solved. That's the difference between a program that fails and one that succeeds despite setbacks.
Let's shift perspective and talk about what it was like to actually sail on these ships, because Liberty ships weren't just statistics. They were home to thousands of merchant mariners who lived and died aboard them. Merchant mariners in WW2 had the statistically highest casualty rate of any American service, higher than Marines, higher than Army infantry, higher than bomber crews. 1 in 26 mariners who sailed on Liberty ships died during the war. They faced U-boats, surface raiders, mines, aircraft, and storms. And they did it without the recognition given to military personnel. Merchant mariners weren't considered veterans until decades after the war. Living conditions aboard Liberty ships were basic. The crew quarters were cramped, bunks stacked in small cabins, shared by men working opposite shifts. The food was generally adequate but monotonous. Ships carried livestock, chickens, sometimes a pig, to provide fresh eggs and meat, but mostly the diet was canned and preserved goods. The ships were slow, painfully slow. Remember that 11-knot top speed? A fast destroyer could do 35 knots. Even surfaced U-boats could outrun a Liberty ship. This made them sitting ducks. Convoys offered protection, safety in numbers, with destroyer escorts providing defense, but convoys moved at the speed of the slowest ship, which was often a Liberty. The Atlantic crossing took roughly 2 weeks in convoy, assuming good weather and no attacks. 2 weeks of constant vigilance, sleeping in your clothes, ready to abandon ship at any moment, zigzagging to avoid submarines, radio silence, blackout conditions at night, no lights that might silhouette the ship against the horizon. When attacks came, they were terrifying. A torpedo strike often came without warning, a massive underwater explosion that could break a ship's back or blow a hole the size of a house in the hull. Ships could sink in minutes. In winter North Atlantic, you had maybe 10 minutes in the water before hypothermia killed you. Lifeboats were critical, but launching them in rough seas with a ship sinking under you was its own nightmare. But here's what's remarkable. Merchant mariners kept sailing. After ships were sunk, survivors would recover and then sign up for another voyage. The pay was good, triple what you'd make in most civilian jobs, but it wasn't just about money. Many believed in the cause. They were fighting Hitler as surely as any soldier, just without a uniform.
Liberty ships sailed everywhere, literally everywhere the Allies needed supplies. The Murmansk run, convoys to northern Russia through Arctic waters, was considered the worst assignment. Ships faced U-boats, Luftwaffe bombers, surface raiders, and pack ice simultaneously. Temperatures so cold that sea spray froze instantly on deck, creating ice that had to be constantly chipped away or it would capsize the ship. Crews on the Murmansk run saw things that gave them nightmares for life. Torpedoed ships sinking with men trapped inside, aircraft bombing defenseless merchantmen, entire convoys scattered and destroyed. The Mediterranean was another hellhole, running supplies to North Africa, to Malta, to Italy after the invasion. Narrow waters, enemy aircraft overhead, mines, E-boats, German fast attack craft, and submarines. The Malta convoys were particularly brutal. The island was under siege, and supply ships were literally its lifeline. Convoys would leave Britain with 12 ships and arrive in Malta with 3, the rest scattered on the seabed. The Pacific theater presented different challenges: vast distances, typhoons, Japanese submarines, though less effective than German U-boats, kamikazes later in the war, suicide aircraft that targeted shipping. And the logistics were staggering. Every bullet, every drop of fuel, every can of food for American forces in the Pacific had to cross thousands of miles of ocean. Liberty ships were the trucks of that supply line. D-Day, June 6, 1944, involved hundreds of Liberty ships. They carried the vehicles, the ammunition, the supplies that made the Normandy invasion possible. After the beachhead was secured, Liberty ships continued running supplies across the English Channel, building up the material reserves that would sustain the armies driving across Europe. One Liberty ship, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, actually participated in the D-Day invasion and is still afloat today in San Francisco, a floating museum.
If you ever get the chance, go aboard, walk the decks, stand in the cargo holds. Try to imagine what it was like when those holds were packed with ammunition, when U-boats were hunting, when the sea was trying to kill you. When the war ended in 1945, the Liberty Ship program stopped abruptly. Thousands of ships suddenly had no mission. Some were kept in service, converted to civilian cargo carriers, sold to shipping companies, transferred to foreign nations as war reparations or aid. But many were simply anchored in vast, mothball fleets, hundreds of ships tied up in places like the Hudson River, San Francisco Bay, the James River, waiting for a future that might need them. The Korean War reactivated some Liberty ships, same with various Cold War emergencies, but by the 1960s they were hopelessly obsolete. Modern cargo ships were larger, faster, more efficient. Container shipping was revolutionizing the industry. Liberty ships were relics. Many were scrapped, cut up for metal, their steel recycled into cars and buildings. Some were intentionally sunk as breakwaters or artificial reefs. A few were converted into floating storage. One famous Liberty ship, the SS Albert M. Bow, was converted into an electronics test ship for the Navy and served until 1960. But here's an odd footnote. Some Liberty ships are still out there, still working. In the 1960s and 70s, shipping companies in Greece and other nations bought Liberty ships for pennies on the dollar and ran them until they literally fell apart. The last operational Liberty ship in commercial service was retired in the 1980s, 40 years after it was built for what everyone assumed would be a short, brutal life. Today, only 2 Liberty ships survive as museums, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco and the SS John W. Brown in Baltimore. Both are maintained by volunteers, both are still capable of sailing. They're floating monuments to the men who built them, the men who sailed them, and the era when America's industrial might turned the tide of a world war. The Liberty Ships program's influence on manufacturing, logistics, and engineering cannot be overstated. The lessons learned rippled forward through decades. Let's trace some of those threads. First, mass production of complex systems. Before Liberty Ships, mass production worked for simple, small items, cars, rifles, radios. Liberty Ships proved you could apply assembly line logic to something as complex as an ocean-going vessel. This directly influenced post-war manufacturing, commercial aircraft production, nuclear power plant construction, even spacecraft assembly borrowed concepts pioneered in the Liberty Ship program. Second, the power of standardization and interchangeability. Every Liberty ship being identical meant that parts, supplies, and even entire sections could be swapped between vessels. This modular thinking influenced post-war construction across industries. Container shipping, the system that moves 90% of world trade today, is fundamentally an extension of Liberty ship modularity thinking. Third, the program demonstrated that worker training could be compressed through task specialization. You don't need to train someone to build an entire ship. You train them to do one job exceptionally well. This idea influenced post-war vocational education, industrial training programs, and even the structure of modern factories. Fourth, the engineering lessons. The structural failures of Liberty ships led to fundamental advances in fracture mechanics, metallurgy, and stress analysis. Constance Tipper's work on brittle fracture influenced everything from the construction of Liberty ships' successors to the design of pipelines that wouldn't crack in Arctic conditions. The understanding that materials behave differently at different temperatures, that stress concentration matters, that design must account for worst-case conditions, these weren't new ideas, but Liberty ships made them concrete and unavoidable. Fifth, the program showed the importance of adaptive engineering, When ships started breaking in half, the response wasn't to give up or blame workers or hide the problem. It was to study, understand, and fix. Engineering on the fly, improving designs while maintaining production, retrofitting existing ships while building new ones. This agile approach to large-scale manufacturing was revolutionary. But perhaps the most profound legacy wasn't industrial, it was social. The Liberty Ship program and the wartime industries it represented fundamentally changed American society in ways that are still playing out today. Women in the workforce. Yes, most women left industrial jobs after the war, pushed out by men returning from military service, by social pressure, by government policies. But the genie was out of the bottle. Women had proved they could do any job. A generation of daughters grew up knowing their mothers had built ships, welded steel, operated cranes. That knowledge didn't disappear. It fed the women's rights movements of the 1960s and 70s. It's a direct line from Wendy the welder to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. African American workers. The shipyards were segregated, discriminatory, and far from equal, but they also provided economic opportunities and industrial skills to black workers on a scale never seen before. A black welder making $1.20 an hour in a Kaiser shipyard was earning 3 or 4 times what he could make in agriculture or domestic service. That economic power, those skills, that sense of capability, they contributed to the civil rights movement that would emerge in the 1950s. Economic power translates to political power eventually. Migration patterns. The Liberty Ship program drew workers from across America to coastal shipyards. Southern black families moved to Richmond, California. Dust Bowl farmers migrated to Portland, Oregon. These weren't temporary moves. People put down roots. Communities formed. The demographic map of America was redrawn. Cities like Richmond ballooned from 24,000 people in 1940 to 100,000 in 1943. That kind of explosive growth created lasting change. Union power. The shipyards were heavily unionized. Workers organized, negotiated, struck, even during the war, though this was controversial. The industrial unions gained membership, power, and influence that would shape post-war America. The middle class of the 1950s and 60s, the prosperity that made America a superpower, was built in part on the foundation of wartime industrial wages and union organization.
Let's be precise about Liberty Ship's role in Allied victory, because it's easy to overstate or understate their importance. They weren't the only factor, obviously, but they were a critical enabling factor for several key strategic realities. First, they kept Britain in the war. Without Liberty ships replacing losses, the tonnage war would have strangled Britain by late 1942 or early 1943. No supplies means no resistance. No resistance means negotiated peace with Germany or outright surrender. The entire European theater depended on Britain surviving, and Britain surviving depended on merchant shipping. Liberty ships provided that shipping. Second, they enabled the American buildup in Britain for D-Day. Operation Overlord required assembling millions of tons of equipment, supplies, and troops in Britain. That couldn't happen by aircraft. Bombers can't carry tanks and trucks. It had to happen by ship. Liberty ships carried the materiel that made D-Day possible. Every jeep, every artillery shell, every gallon of fuel for the invasion force came across the Atlantic in merchant hulls, many of them Liberty ships. Third, they sustained the Pacific campaign. Island hopping across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, required vast logistical support. Every captured island needed supplies to support the troops holding it and to serve as a base for the next operation. Liberty ships were the supply line. MacArthur's army and Nimitz's fleet depended on them. Fourth, they enabled Lend-Lease.
The U.S. sent enormous quantities of supplies to allies, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, Free French forces, and others. Trucks, aircraft, food, raw materials, weapons. Liberty ships carried it all. Stalin himself acknowledged that Lend-Lease was critical to Soviet survival. Those supplies largely traveled on Liberty ships. Here's a counterfactual to consider. What if the Liberty ship program had failed? What if Kaiser's methods hadn't worked? Or if the structural failures had been catastrophic enough to ground the fleet? Or if production had been slower? The Allies would have faced a stark choice: build fewer ships using traditional methods and hope it was enough, or surrender control of the Atlantic to Germany. Either outcome likely means Germany wins the war, or at least forces a negotiated peace that leaves Hitler in power. Let's end with the numbers, because they tell the story better than anything else. 2,710 ships built in 4 years. 27 million tons of cargo carried during the war. Roughly 200 Liberty ships lost to enemy action, torpedoed, bombed, mined, or sunk by surface raiders. That's a loss rate of about 7%, which sounds high until you realize that merchant shipping in WW1 had loss rates over 20%. The ships cost, on average, less than $2 million each. Total program cost, roughly $5.4 billion in 1940s dollars, maybe $90 billion today adjusted for inflation. For comparison, the Manhattan Project, building the atomic bomb, cost about $2 billion in 1940s dollars. America spent 2.5 times as much on cargo ships as on the ultimate weapon, because cargo ships, not bombs, win long wars. The workers. At peak, the 18 shipyards building Liberty ships employed roughly 250,000 workers. Over the course of the war, probably close to 1 million Americans worked on Liberty ship construction at some point. They worked around the clock, in all weather, for wages that were good but not extraordinary. The average worker in a Kaiser shipyard made about $1.20 per hour. Skilled workers, maybe $1.50. The average work week was 60 hours, 10-hour days, 6 days a week. Casualties among merchant mariners. Approximately 9,500 American merchant sailors died during WW2, out of roughly 243,000 who served. That's a casualty rate of about 3.9%. For context, the U.S. military overall had a casualty rate of about 2.5%. Merchant mariners were dying at higher rates than soldiers, and they weren't considered veterans.
So what does it all mean? What's the lesson of the Liberty ships beyond the historical details and the engineering specifications? I think it's this. When a society decides something is existential, when it treats a challenge as truly do or die, it can accomplish things that seem impossible. The Liberty ship program worked because America treated it as existential, not just important, not just a priority, existential. Lose the tonnage war, lose everything. That focus enabled radical changes. Traditional shipbuilders had to adapt or get out of the way. Labor practices changed overnight. Women and minorities got opportunities they'd been denied for generations, not because society suddenly became enlightened, but because the need was so desperate that barriers had to fall. Innovation happened at breakneck speed because failure wasn't an option. But there's a darker edge to this story, too. The Liberty ship program worked because thousands of merchant mariners died bringing supplies across submarine-infested oceans. It worked because ships broke in half and design flaws were accepted as the cost of speed. It worked because workers were pushed to their limits and beyond, working 60-hour weeks in dangerous conditions. The miracle had a price, and real people paid it. The Liberty ships were not perfect. They were not elegant. Naval architects still cringe at them. Too slow, too simple, too crude. But they were enough. And in war, enough is sometimes all you need.
Perfect is the enemy of good, and good is the enemy of finished. Liberty ships were finished. They sailed, they carried cargo, they sustained armies, they won a war. Today, when we talk about mobilizing to address climate change or pandemic preparedness or any other large-scale challenge, the Liberty ships offer both inspiration and warning. Inspiration because they show what focused, desperate effort can achieve. Warning because they show the costs of that achievement, the lives lost, the corners cut, the sacrifices demanded. The two surviving Liberty ships, the Jeremiah O'Brien and the John W. Brown, aren't just museum pieces. They're reminders. Reminders that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the stakes are high enough. Reminders that industrial might can be decisive. Reminders that engineering is about solving problems, not achieving perfection. Reminders that mass production done right can change the world. Henry Kaiser never built another ship after the war. He went back to construction, built highways, founded a healthcare company that still bears his name. But the Liberty ships remained his legacy, not because they were beautiful or innovative in themselves, but because they were exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed. That's the lesson. Not that we should build more Liberty ships. We shouldn't. They're obsolete technology. The lesson is that when survival is on the line, when the equation is simple and brutal, human ingenuity and determination can rewrite what's possible. A nation can build ships faster than the enemy can sink them. A housewife from Oklahoma can become a welder, building vessels that cross oceans. An engineer can look at a year-long process and compress it to 30 days. The Liberty ships didn't win World War II alone, but they made victory possible. They were the trucks, the trains, the supply line that kept armies moving, economies functioning, resistance alive. They were 441 feet of welded steel, slow and ugly and utterly essential. And that's why their story matters. Not because they were the best ships ever built, but because they were the right ships, built at the right time by the right people. That's not a miracle. That's what happens when a nation decides to act like its survival depends on it, because it did.